themes of the session, particularly around welfare, student welfare, inclusion, widening participation, but also the omnipresent theme of educational quality. The presentation is based upon work I started to do a number of years ago in developing a student workload planning tool. Now, a few years ago, I made that available to colleagues through the Wellbeing Pedagogies Library, and I'd just like to talk to you about some of the work I've done since. I suppose all in all, the interest that I've had over a number of years, as I say, is to take the concept of time, which I think is related to in quite a nebulous way by lots of individuals within higher education, and to make it more concrete and to maybe help other people create more of a concrete connection, fundamentally for the benefit of students, but also ourselves as educational practitioners. In the session, I really wish I might have had maybe longer than 10 minutes, because I would have liked to have heard answers from the people in the room to my question. Given the scenario of if you had to plan a 15 CAT module, how many hours of student learning effort, so learning and assessment, would you need to have as part of your plan? Not sure what people in the room would have said, although I've got some ideas, but I mean, in terms of the Warwick framework, it should be 10 hours per CAT, so we're talking about 150 hours. And something key here is that I think a lot of people maybe don't necessarily immediately think or realise is that this includes absolutely everything. So this is all learning opportunities, this is all assessments, this is all kind of mandatory field trips, let's say, because the whole framework is designed to create a sort of an accounting basis for the fair and appropriate comparison of different educational opportunities, and ultimately some kind of measure of quality in terms of just being given enough learning opportunity. It's related to external assurance, because Warwick University, like many good universities, is part of the QAA. But it's, for me, is not just a compliance issue. If we are designing 15 CAT modules that ultimately require more than 150 hours of students, 150 hours of work from students, we are, in my view, creating a welfare and inclusion problem for ourselves, because we are generating amounts of work that don't fit within the structures in the way that they're supposed to. On the other hand, if we are actually requiring less work, we've got to reflect and realise that therefore our module isn't worth the amount of credit that we are claiming it is, and therefore we can fall short of educational quality expectations at that level. I don't think I said this in the session, but I mean the thinnest end of the wedge here is if a student were to realise this, then to start to bring a legal challenge to say, well, like the university has not complied with the frameworks that as were advertised and as is expected. So I think while a lot of people see legal risk in developing our understanding of this issue, I think they're overlooking the possibility of the legal risk that's potentially coming anyway if we don't act on this. But I don't think this is realistically happening very much. I think the tendency is to require students to do more work as opposed to less than the required CAT status. Just to talk through the kind of the cycle and I guess the point of my presentation, these frameworks come down from the QAA. They are internalised into the university's governance framework through the educational quality team and the various frameworks. But the question that interests me in raising with colleagues is, to what extent does your planning of a particular module reflect these expectations? And the university has provided some centralised support in terms of the development of the online digital module proposal system, which is good. So it now requires more detail to be added in terms of hours for contact time, but also assessment and private study. So this supports module designers. But the reality is, if you go into the module catalogue, you pick any random module that you want, I would say I would put my money on there being less information as opposed to more. Now, this is an approved module at the University of Warwick in the Faculty of Arts that I found on the morning of the presentation. There's no data filled in whatsoever, so there's no manifest thinking here around how long students are expected to revise for these exams. There's not even any contact hours put in, let alone private study time and other assessment time. So this is there's no evidence here that this module complies with any of the expectations or is been designed in a responsible way, and I think that's a bit of a problem. So overall, my guess is that anyone answering this question for themselves would say, well, actually, if I'm honest, I haven't thought about this very much, and I don't think anyone needs to feel particularly bad about that. Last summer, I ran a very small pilot research project with, I think it's 15 colleagues from across the whole university, a range of different grades and contract types and external accreditations for their sort of the level of professional development and competency it had in terms of being a higher education practitioner. And they didn't really know what CATs were about either. So I think the most relevant thing here is that only 4 people responded to my open question, which was, what do you know about CATs in reference to curriculum and module design? And had follow-up probing questions. Only 4 people specifically knew that 1 CAT should equal 10 hours, and that was a fundamental part of appropriate curriculum and module design. More people, 11 out of 15, had an understanding that there was some kind of relationship, but only 2 thought about this in the most general sense, and nobody reported thinking about this in any detail. So, reflecting on some sort of on the question as to to what degree is this getting taken into account in the actual design and delivery of education at the University of Warwick, the answer, I think, on the basis of this is not anywhere near as much as it should be. And indeed, a quote there from one participant, not as much as I should perhaps. And indeed, by the end of our discussion, they had realised that that was definitely seemed to be the case. Just one more little sort of extract from the questions that I asked. So asking people what was the maximum number of hours a learner should be required to work by a university in terms of their whole degree for the period of a week. And the vast majority of respondents looked at full-time study as a full-time job. So they said, between about 36 and 40 hours. 40 hours was the the most common response. Although a lot of colleagues talked in more kind of qualitative terms, I guess. So this shows that colleagues have some kind of benchmark as to a maximum amount of work. But the degree to which this is concretized in design and delivery, I think, is something that needs to be questioned and probably remedied quite urgently. The one possible option that I would propose for this is for colleagues to have a play with my workload modeling tool. Fundamentally, it asks you for the same details as the MA1 form. So if you've got an MA1 form in the state that it should probably really be at this stage, with these numbers of hours allocated for assessment, for contact time, etc., that can just go in the spreadsheet. But the spreadsheet pushes us towards a deeper level of reflection. So this is for my own 20 CAT postgraduate module, and it just provides me with a constant reminder that I shouldn't be setting any more than 13.3 hours a week, assuming that the student is doing 2 other 20 CAT modules. Because if I set more than that, then I'm starting to ramp up the amount of hours that they're required to do. It then asks me for how much synchronous and asynchronous learning opportunities that I expect an average student to be using to engage with the module. It asks me to think in detail about assessment. So if I'm requiring a presentation to be delivered in week 10, how many hours do I expect the student to put into the preparation, the research and the development of that? And where realistically would I ask, or would I expect or advise the student to distribute those hours through a term? what the tool then does is in the sort of the first column on the left there, tells you how many hours you therefore have planned for the student for their work week. But then on the outside writer column, it says, well, if all module conveners of the modules, the other modules that the student was taking, made the same assumptions, this is what would happen. And what we can see here is something that I imagine is very common. I've thought, week 9, week 10, can push the hours because I need to get an assessment done. Life's life. Students can work a bit harder. But what that shows is we're now creeping up to 42 hours if all of the module conveners make the same decisions. The spreadsheet also allows me to pop in some notes about when certain assessments are due, and this feeds in a moment. So to stick with my theme of Einstein, thinking about the nature of time, the question arises, how ingenious is my thinking and my modelling? Well, one practical application is that in my Moodle, I can constantly provide students with a point of reference that each week you should be working about 13 hours on this module. I can tell them, remind them, of course, that we've got a workshop for 2 hours. And then I can, thinking about the nature of other work that I expect in terms of readings, how longer those are, how complex they are, the level of learner reading abilities, etc. I can start to make suggestions about how long a certain piece of work might take. And this is not to say that it should be presented to students as, this should be the case, but it provides information for the start of a conversation. So if students are doing it more quickly or less quickly than I am anticipating, we can look for adjustments on both sides. And it might be that I need to kind of remedy my expectations, but it also might be that it helps the student realize that actually their reading does seem to be systematically at the lower end of their colleagues, and therefore there might be genuine value in exploring development opportunities around reading skills, for example. I can also start to talk to students about how long they should spend undertaking assessment. I think the general model is students treat assessment like filling a room with gas. You kind of fill it in till it fills the whole space. Balloon. Filling a balloon with a gas. You kind of do it till it explodes, and then you have to hand it in, so it's too late. Where actually, if you can say to a student, this work I think should take you 25 hours to research and write, it gives the student a benchmark to then help better time manage in line with other expectations within their life. So we can be more transparent, I think, with students and with ourselves, and more reflective about our practices. I do think we can push the maths deeper. So this sheet represents our new MASC degree, and I've combined together the planning for and expectations for my module, for colleagues' modules. I think this. We have the 3 20CAT core modules in the first term, and in a very similar way to the previous sheet, it then totals up the actual planned number of hours that students would be expected to complete. And right away, we can see here in week 6 that if the student if our expectations are accurate and the student follows our recommendations, they're going to be working 48 hours a week. Now, as I mentioned in the session, UK law suggests that no employer can ask an employee to work more than 48 hours a week. Universities pretend this doesn't apply to academics, but actually I have reason to believe that it does. And all our contracts are legally dubious, but that's a different session. But fundamentally, the point here is this is an awful lot of work. But we can then use this tool to start to diagnose what maybe is going on and to think about remedy. So here I can see that there's an assessment due, and then I can trace this to the particular module, and I can see how many hours are allocated. We can already see right here that instead of setting 13 hours of work, this middle module is expecting 20. And this of course, this creates the workload pressure, which I think is unreasonable and a bit dangerous. When we start to see this, it doesn't take a huge leap of intelligence and imagination to start to appreciate why students get very stressed about workload, and we know that because we know it from national reports, and we know it from our own welfare services from our time as personal tutors. We can start to ask questions about widening participation. So if a student is required to work part-time to fund their studies, and we're asking them to work 48 hours in that week, we've got to reflect and say, well, actually, maybe this makes even less sense than it otherwise might do. So we've got a widening participation angle. We obviously have students with a huge range of specific learning impairments, where the time pressure exists for the students who aren't facing these additional challenges. It's obviously going to be more challenging for students that have additional needs. So there's an inclusion and an equalities angle here. Arguably, if we are expecting too much work in a given week, that's indirect discrimination on the grounds of potentially disability, because while it's a universal policy or a universal expectation of a student, it is disproportionately falling upon the detriment on the shoulders of those students who find themselves less advantaged. The university rightly promotes all manner of extracurricular activities. So we have the new Warwick framework, which for the employability skills. Now this is accrediting some existing activities, but will develop more of its own activities. So at the moment we're kind of collecting things together. The other issue I think this approach opens helps to put into focus is that the standard response to people who are having difficulties with time management and stress is to provide them more opportunities to do things. So we have lots of workshops on managing your time. And while that still might be useful, there is some level of irony in telling somebody that's working 48 hours a week that they just need to go to another workshop and make it a 49th hour or a 50th hour, because then they might learn to manage it better. I don't think it's acceptable to take an inappropriate level of responsibility for planning someone's time and then tell them they just have to basically learn to deal with it. I think the other issue that crops up here, and this is even more difficult, is that of deadlines and extensions. So if our current response to students who experience mitigating circumstances is to provide extensions. This, of course, doesn't create any more time in their degree unless they take temporary withdrawal and use some of the withdrawn time to catch up on some of the learning, but that shouldn't really happen in the way that we expect it to. So all we're doing is displacing an amount of work that's already too much because we haven't planned in enough detail to the future, and that's just further disabling an impaired student as opposed to enabling them. So this is a real this cuts to the heart of student welfare, inclusion, but also educational quality. And we should not be surprised, I think, that the level of stress, workload-related stress that our students experience. However, I think this is completely soluble, and with sufficient political will, could be addressed very quickly. The first thing is to develop the level of detail that module designers are expected to design their modules in. And while I appreciate there's a valid argument to say this is extra time pressure on staff, it is, but we are dealing with something that is fundamental to the system. So spending 40 minutes just thinking about actually how much work you think your module is can pay so many dividends to your students and possibly to yourself. So I would say if we're going to ask staff to do anything additional beyond the humongous workload they've already got, it's spending time planning time for themselves and for students. And I think this fits hand in hand with the shape of the academic year. I think the process is currently paused because there were lots of different opinions, but I think fundamentally we have reached a point where action needs to be taken, because otherwise I think we're putting our fingers in our ears and just expecting those people who currently suffer and experience harm and essentially subsidise the system's ability to continue to go on doing that until we've got got our management of this situation in order. So I think these two things together could make a huge structural change and improvement to our learners, but also our staff. So I will leave it there. Thank you very much.